Welcome back. We have been discussing principles of Bible interpretation, and this week we want to move into another area that's important for interpreting the scriptures correctly, and that is understanding how genre or the types of literature impacts how we read the Bible, how we interpret the Bible, and how we apply the Bible. So the Bible is full of many different types of literature. So for example, we have poetry that is interspersed throughout the entirety of Scripture. We have a book of Psalms, which is a collection of poems. And so if we want to just look at poetry in its distilled format there, we have 150 poems that have been collected for us and arranged in the Psalter. We also have legal literature, though. If you look at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, the law, or often translated the instructions from God, interspersed in there is legal literature. And each of these kinds of genre, poetry, legal literature, maybe prophecy, letters, all of them have slightly different rules for how we read them. And these are actually pretty obvious to us, even in our own culture. In other words, when we want to buy a car, the contract does not come to us written in poetry. That would not be appropriate. That would be the wrong kind of genre to sign a contract and to actually need details and to need precise language. However, when we're writing something that expresses our love to our wife, we don't write that in terms of contract, right? We write that in terms of poetry. The language is supposed to be emotive and full of imagery. It's supposed to capture these pictures in our mind and relate them to something that maybe is not quite concrete, but it's still there. It's affection and emotion. It's imagery. It's beautiful. It's supposed to be powerful. So each of these just examples of literature have very different rules for how we interpret them. Think in terms of Proverbs as well. It's unfortunate that Proverbs are often understood by Christians to be promises, but really this is incorrect. Proverbs are, proverbial. In other words, they're general truth. So I can't tell you how many times as I've been talking or listening to believers as they're talking about their parenting with their children, and they will often quote Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And they look at this almost as a promise. Well, if I do my job, if I make sure that we center our family around the Scriptures and around Jesus, and they're in church and they go to youth group, that my kids will grow up and they will love the Lord and they will be obedient. However, this is not what the proverb is saying. The proverb is saying, generally speaking, that the way we train up our children, particularly if it's in the ways of the Lord, when they are older, they will choose to continue to walk in those paths. But we all know exceptions to these proverbs. We all know children that have grown up in great homes but have made choices to not follow in the footsteps of the teachings of the Lord. And the opposite is also true. We know of stories where children have grown up in families that were not centered on the Scriptures, and yet they have come to know the Lord and they have walked faithfully with Him. So this is general truth, and by misunderstanding the genre, we actually misunderstand what the author is trying to say. So interpreting and applying the Scriptures well is genre dependent. I want to talk in this lesson about narrative genre, and in the next lesson, we're going to finish up talking about narrative genre. So this is a 2-week process here. Over 40% of the Old Testament is narrative, and over 60% of the New Testament is narrative. And this may come as kind of a surprise to us because that is just a lot of the text comes to us actually in story or in narrative. And it's unfortunate that these narratives have sometimes been overlooked by us. If we've grown up in the church, maybe we're familiar to those being taught in Sunday school. Maybe we remember flannel graphs or little videos of this kind of thing of, David and Goliath and Noah and the ark and that kind of stuff. And so we have these stories kind of rattling around in our brain, but as we get older, we don't necessarily go back and revisit those because we almost interpret those as moral tales. Well, little guys can do big things too. That's the moral tale of David and Goliath. Well, that's really not what the author intended when we go back and look at the David and Goliath narrative. In fact, narratives are powerful accounts of God's work in history. They are artistic. In other words, the author has skillfully woven them together and has retold them, and they have specific agendas and goals for our life. And so this leads really to a definition of narrative and to some characteristics of narrative. What is narrative? Particularly biblical narrative. Biblical narratives are non-poetic accounts. which dramatically tell the unfolding of God's mighty work of redemption. They're dramatic accounts, and they retell the actual activity of God in redemption. These are historical accounts. In other words, they report history. They're based on real events. They're not creations based on just the imagination of the author. Also, they are rhetorical. In other words, the author is intending to persuade you of something. And lastly, they are theological. The author desires to reveal God and his interaction in the world. So when we read biblical narrative, we need to keep in mind that these are historical accounts that are persuading me to do and to think and to feel something, and also to reveal who God is and how he is going to interact with his creation. Rhetorical, theological, and historical. Well, what are we to observe in narrative? In other words, our pattern of observe the text, interpret the text, and apply the text still holds true for narratives. However, narratives have a structure, and so because of this, it guides us in what to observe. Once again, just like a good detective, we want to know where we're supposed to be looking in the text. And thankfully, the biblical authors, in their writing of narrative, are very skilled, and they guide their readers in what to be looking for. One of the key things we need to recognize is that the main aspect of narrative is the plot. In other words, plot is the storyline or the conflict that the main character is experiencing. And although I don't want to dismiss character studies, because those can be helpful as well, it's important that we recognize that the biblical characters are really not the main point of the text. It's the interaction of the biblical characters with conflict, with plot. It's how they trust God or fail to trust God in the midst of the narrative. That's really the key to the narrative, is examining what is the conflict and how does it get resolved. So, first of all, we need to recognize who the main character is, and we need to recognize what conflict is facing the main character. And by answering these two fundamental questions, it actually sets us on a trajectory to be able to interpret narrative well. There's a helpful chart that we have for breaking down the components of a narrative. It begins with understanding the prologue. So the prologue is normally very brief in biblical narrative. It introduces the main character, and it introduces the setting. And then from here, we move very quickly usually to an introduction of the conflict. In other words, there is some problem that is facing the main character. And then from there, we see that conflict, that problem often escalates. There are other things that enter into the story to make it a complex narrative. Now, not all narratives have this extra addition. Some of them are actually fairly brief and self-contained, but oftentimes these problems will expand. And then inevitably, there's a point of a resolution where either the main character succeeds in his conflict, or maybe the main character fails in his conflict. Maybe the main character fails, but God enters in and saves the day. And then from there, we see that there's an epilogue. Oftentimes, this is a very brief sentence or two where the author is letting us know, hey, this narrative is ending and I'm moving to the next one. So if we think in terms of this trajectory, prologue, conflict, development, resolution, and then epilogue, if we think in terms of that graph and apply that to narratives, it actually gives us a structure for narrative that is going to be very helpful in not only observing the text, but interpreting the text. Well, let's practice here for a bit. Turning your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. I've already mentioned the David and Goliath story. And one of the reasons why this is a fun story to talk about is because we're generally familiar with the contours of the story. We may not be familiar with all the details of it. We may not have looked at it in a while. But generally we understand that David, being a young man, is fighting Goliath, who's a giant warrior. And of course, God saves the day and enables David to be successful and slay Goliath. All of those are true statements. There's nothing wrong with that. However, let's use our chart here to understand how the author has structured this story to see if maybe there's more to the story that we've missed. Maybe there's an emphasis that we can change here. So if we look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, just the first 3 verses, we'll see that the prologue is very clearly stated here. In other words, the setting and the main character is introduced. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up in a line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Perfect prologue, exactly what we would expect. So what's the setting? There's a battle that's going on. Is that the conflict? No, because so far we haven't seen anything that's necessarily negative for our main character, a problem that they've had to face. We may say, well, being in a battle and being in war is a conflict. Yes, but so far the author is saying this is just the setting. I've got the Philistines on one side and Saul and the Israelites on the other. So already this causes us to ask, wait a minute, if that's the setting, then who's the main character? Well, it's Israel. Israel ends up being the main character for this story. Let's see how it progresses. So in verses 4 through 11, we have our introduction of conflict. We have the introduction of Goliath. And Goliath is very well detailed in this text. So I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll just begin with a little bit. And then we're going to jump down to the end of the introduction of the conflict, verse 11. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And then we get quite a bit of detail here. Go down to verse 8. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, we'll be your servants. If I win, you'll be our servants." So Goliath comes out and lays down this challenge. Let's just cut to the quick here. You send out your best warrior. If I beat them, you guys serve us. If you beat me, then we'll serve you. And this is our introduction of conflict, and we know this because of verse 11. When Saul and all Israel, in other words, our main character, heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So here we see now our main character frozen in fear. And so that means that after the conflict, we should expect development of conflict, we should expect resolution, and we should expect epilogue. Well, guess what happens in verse 12? The author quickly changes scenes, and we're introduced to David. And of course, David plays a very significant role in this story. It will be beneficial to work through the rest of this narrative on your own. And so I want to encourage you to work through the entirety of chapter 17 here, all the way to verse 58. Try to discern, based on what I've introduced here from the prologue and the introduction to conflict, attempt to find the verses that talk about the resolution of the conflict. Where is it that Israel's fear and their dismay, because that's what we talked about being the conflict part here, from Goliath, where is that finally resolved? Then from there, ask yourself, what's the epilogue? How does the author wrap up this story? And then go backwards and look at verses 12 all the way to your resolution and ask yourself, where is the development of this story? There's actually quite a bit of development in this narrative. In other words, the author could have just said Israel was in a battle and Goliath is their enemy, and David comes in and kind of saves the day, the end. In other words, this story could have been much shorter, but the author is relaying a lot of detail here because the story is escalating. The development is significant. There's lots of things that happen in this development. So first, find out where the conflict is resolved. Second, discern where the where the epilogue takes place, and then go backwards and discover the development. Then the final point that I would like you to look at here is to read closely David's speech to Goliath while he's going out to fight him, because it is here that you see David express his theology. He expresses his beliefs as to why he thinks that God is going to deliver him and what God's purpose is in this deliverance. So focus on that as a final thought question for discovery. Next week, we're going to finish out talking about biblical narrative, and we're going to talk about now moving from the structure of narrative to how we can interpret that and then apply the text.